Thank you so much. Those were three great talks, and they really connected together in so many different ways. I want to just bring in a couple questions to start, and then we'll open it up to the floor to get to hear from the audience. And I know there's several here with a lot of interest in both Chilean and U.S. policymaking. I want to start with one point that struck me, and I would love the reactions of all three panelists on this. Really something that struck me between the first two panels. So Ruth Levine made the point in the first panel that at times in policymaking, she said transparency can reduce trust. That if there's that was one of the things I really took from that first panel, that, you know, sometimes when you open up the analysis, then your policy partners, you know, may not want to work with you because there could be bad headlines. I think that was the way she put it, which sounds very, very reasonable. We just heard about the Chilean case where my take on the talks was sort of the opposite, where it felt like the transparency in analysis could actually promote trust and promote public trust in the process. And we heard from Danny as well about the importance of transparency and sort of building trust. So it felt like there was a bit of a tension there. So I would love for each of the panelists to comment on this sort of general issue of, you know, is transparency in policy analysis going to reduce or increase trust? And as a kind of side point, I wanted to ask whether this is very context specific. So we heard about the Chilean tradition, and we heard about this from the undersecretary, the tradition of transparency in government. We heard about the tradition in the US government of transparency, at least in certain ways. So is it the case that open policy analysis will promote trust and lead to sort of better policy in some places, but not others? I'm just curious about the big picture, but with some specific thinking about the Chilean case and the US case. So I'm not sure what order to go in. I think we could maybe go in the order of the initial presentations, if David wants to start, and then maybe the undersecretary, and then Danny.
Okay, great. Well, in the case of Chile, I guess we have moved progressively towards more transparency. The undersecretary mentioned some of these major points in time where with legislation that have improved that. We also have this Council for Transparency that has, I think it's 12 or 13 years. We have had this law, and so yeah, ordinary people could just request a lot of information from public services. In fact, the Council for Transparency has been very interested in what we have been doing, because at the beginning, the transparency law created that kind of problems of trust. I mean, but now we are all used to do that. So I think it's a question of maybe some kind of inertia that we need to break. I think that for us, this transparency and reproducibility stuff is going to is a way to meet different parties, opposition groups, the kind of polarization we have today in Chile in some discussions. And I think it's an opportunity. I see transparency now as an opportunity in our country, and this is the way I see for pension reform.
Please go ahead, Undersecretary.
Thank you for the question. I think it's very important. I think that at least the general evidence when we compare countries is that actually transparency is present more often in societies that are also with higher levels of trust. Well, you never know which comes first, no? If trust converts into transparency, or transparency affect trust, maybe in both directions, no? And in the case of Chile, for example, we carried out some social dialogue in the context of the tax reform as well. We went to all regions of the country to talk with the people, with civil society, with experts, with managers of different firms, workers, and one of the issues, one of the important issues in terms of taxes, for example, was the people want to know where my taxes go, how the government spend the money it collects, what taxes we pay and why. There was a great demand for transparency in that sense. And I think that kind of question and that kind of answers also from the government helps to build more trust in the government spending, for example. And in nowadays, not only in Chile, but I think in the global terms, democracies probably get stronger if people know how public policy are designed, why they are designed in certain ways and not others, and also what the government does with their budget, why we finance the public policies we have. I think there is a great demand for participation as well, and transparency in public policy is a kind of participation and build knowledge in the government and in society in general.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Danny.
Sure. I think, yes, absolutely. The transparency, for example, in the cost benefit regulation space. I mean, if you're going to tell people you can't drive that old car that you love because it's emitting too much carbon dioxide, you need to have some transparent analysis that says the cost that this has in America is worth it because the benefits exceed the costs. You know, now you can drive in Los Angeles and there's not smog everywhere. People have to see that the rules that we're putting on people's lives, especially when they're not being voted on, done by an executive branch, unelected, by a bureaucrat, that they pass, you know, some cost benefit analysis that's very transparent. I think that the transparency is not a panacea. So we still have, you know, the Trump budget, for example, and all budgets have, you know, some spin on the ball. But I think that an example that is kind of proving the point is for tax enforcement. So the recent Inflation Reduction Act provided $80 billion to the Internal Revenue Service to go after tax cheats, high-end tax cheats who aren't paying their taxes. And right now, the Congressional Scorekeepers, the Congressional Budget Office, doesn't use the they have small revenue impacts of this that it only kind of partially, it only pays for itself a little bit instead of a lot. Why? Because they don't account for the fact that once I know that there are a bunch of people looking into taxes, that I'm going to be less likely to cheat in the first place. This deterrence effect. The administration said this deterrence effect is super large. Don't worry about it. But you need to be transparent in where those numbers come from. And those numbers are guesses. And we have just now more research that's coming out. And I think the requirement that it's transparent, just how much money you're going to get from this, forces the conversation to go in a certain way. It forces the next round of analyses to be better. And I think in 5 years, the next time this comes up, we will actually have transparent analyses that have a better than just a guess, guiding congressional decisions the next time around.
That's great. Thanks so much. Let me open it up and see if there's any questions on, there's a few different, I think, I'm sure, open issues. I see a hand in the back. Go ahead.
The question of data was mentioned, so I'm curious to learn both from the Chilean case and in the US, where we had the Evidence Act more recently, to build these general data infrastructures that's going to make, because a lot of this is going to rely on admin and internal data in order to be able to analyze this stuff, assuming that government internally doesn't have the capacity to do all of this. So I'm curious in Chile, what data infrastructure exists to enable what's going on, and from Danny, what the potential is of some of the new legislation to really move the ball forward, rather than have to do this on a case-by-case basis for a given policy. Thank you.
You want to introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Abhishek Nagraj. I'm here at Berkeley.
Well, maybe Claudia or.
Undersecretary, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is something we need to build really better. We have a lot of good data in general, administrative data, really. In the Ministry of Social Development, for example, there are data from nearly 100% of the population, and because of access to some of the money transfer the government in general has, and also had for the recent pandemic we had 2 years ago, and there is some contacts with research centers to, for example, make research with that data. That is recent, like 2 or 3 years ago. Here we have these island computers as well. I was talking about that in the Superintendence of Pensions, in the Ministry of Finance, in the IRS. So people can come here if they sign a kind of agreement as well. However, we don't have one current institution that has all the data available. So there are general ways to arrive to the data, and I think that's something we want to. We would like to do some step also in our governance is something we as a country owe to ourselves.
David or Danny, anything to add?
Yeah. Well, so, this is another initiative we have tried to pursue for a long time in different academic groups. The last thing we did before the pandemics was a group of academics we went to New Zealand, and we arrived when just the pandemics arrived. So, but we were there because they had this very interesting integrated data infrastructure, and we were there, and it works very well, incredibly well. And I think that that's something that we need, at least in the case of Chile. We have been promoting that. One of the things that we promote was in the discussion in the presidential election, the last presidential election. So we try to make some lobby with the different candidates, and we were successful because in the program of President Boric, there is a paragraph saying we will work on a new integrated data infrastructure, blah, 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 right? So at least it's in the program of the government, right? So we are hoping to, after with Claudia and all the people in the government, we could work on this transparency thing. Maybe the next step would be go there. Because in fact, we have a lot of great data, but in different public institutions. And this is a way we could do it through the Bureau of Statistics. We could do it through other, but there is a good model there are good models, and what we saw in New Zealand was very nice. So and it's in the program of the government, right? So
Danny, any last words?
Sure. The Evidence Act has had a big impact in forcing every department to have a learning agenda that they say, here's how we're going to learn how to do what we do better over the next year. OMB, where I worked, the Office of Management and Budget, hugely involved in that. The Evidence Act needs more money behind it in order to get data all in one place. You have to ask yourself, who's the constituency that wants to sacrifice money from some other bucket and put it in here? And I hope that it could come out of something, for the various divided government congressional arguments. Oh, we need to cut spending. We don't know where to cut spending. Therefore, we need to fund this entity to go tell us how dollars are being spent at various parts of the executive branch, which we already have some institutions for that, but we could think of that way as the key to funding some more data sharing that get more evidence out there in general, that's the constituency that would pound the table for it.
Great. Just before wrapping up and thanking our presenters, I want to just reflect on sort of the 10 or 11 years of BITS. And I don't think 10 years ago we would have thought it was possible that we'd be hearing an undersecretary commenting on the details of the Dataverse and the Python code that they're sharing with all the details of models so the public can scrutinize it and rerun the code. I think we've come a long way, and I just want to recognize the incredible steps forward in Chile. I think they're ahead of almost any other government in the world in this dimension. They're really a leader, and just want to recognize all the work that went into this and thank them for sharing their experience, and Danny for also contrasting with what we're doing here in the US. So thank you very much.